Hello, this is Socially Triggered, and this video is going to be about race realism, a very popular topic for the alt-right to talk about, and those on the left to talk about as well. And it's kind of interesting, the two spectrums. The alt-right will talk about it in a way that they'll try to create some white nationalist kind of movement, and they'll use it to justify certain potentially racist viewpoints. I don't necessarily think that the alt-right is racist, but they can be misconstrued that way. The other side, the left side, want to remove the concept of race because that race has the issue of going against equality. If there's races, then we're different. But if there is no race, then we're all just one human race. Well, that sounds great, that we're all just all the same and we're all equal. It sounds wonderful, but there are actually races. So this video is going to help you if you're ever in the situation where you have to defend the fact that races exist. This video is going to be designed to help you give arguments that will just make it super intuitive that races do exist. And that will be very difficult for somebody to counter-argue that races don't exist. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you the points that usually the race deniers will use as means of saying that there are no races. So the first one that I've heard millions of times is that race is a social construct. Well, that is sort of a meaningless thing to say. Saying that race is a social construct is like saying water is a social construct. Water is a social construct because we define the word water. Well, does that make water any less real? If you put your hand in water, it still gets wet. Well, that's a social construct that we called it water. We just defined something that we observed in nature, which is the different races of humans, and we gave it a name. We called it race. So observed differences, we called those observable differences as the races of people. So yes, it's a social construct, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. That's the very first argument that I always hear. Race is a social construct. Easy to debunk because you just say, well, everything's a social construct because it's our human observation of the world that we create these definitions that we use. And those are used socially and they're social. So not a big deal. Just ignore it. So the next one is when people try to get scientific-y, they try to sound really, really smart, and they talk about how there is genetic variation that goes right across the world, and they always show the picture of where you see like a black person on the far left, where they're really, really dark-skinned, and then on the far right of the spectrum, they show a really light, maybe Asian person, and then they show all the different skin tones in between. And then they say, well, there's no race. There's no, it's just variations within, all the possibilities of the different shades of human. There's no way you can, when do you say that it's this race or this race? There's just all variations. It's just like a spectrum. So that kind of leads to the idea maybe, that there's infinite number of races because each variation would be a different race. But that's not how it works. And the best way to understand this argument and sort of counter it is to look at the spectrum of light. Now, here's a picture of the spectrum of light, that visible light. Now, you'll see that it shows all the different colors. So you'll see in the picture, there's all the spectrum of light, anywhere from violet to red. And this spectrum of light sort of covers all the ranges of colors that we can see. Now you will notice that it gradually changes. It's not like violet goes to red and there's like set divisions in between. No, it's a gradual, subtle change that takes violet to red. So if you look at that, what you'll notice is violet becomes a color. Indigo becomes a color. Blue becomes a color. Green becomes a color. We don't ignore those, even though there's a change in between them. We can define something as being blue because we understand what blue is. Now there's variety of blue. There's baby blue, there's navy blue, there's like different colors of blue, but we understand those different shades of blue to be blue. And the same happens with race. Now, I'll get into this more later, that it's not just skin deep, that there's more to it than that. But the point is, we can define the races the same way. We can say, well, there's different shades of black, but they're all black people. Or there's different types of white people, or different shades within the white group, and those people are white, and they'll have similar characteristics. And black people will have similar characteristics. And Asian people will have similar characteristics. Now, there is some controversy about how many races there are, just like we can say there's many, many colors. But you can't ignore the fact that those colors do exist in the color spectrum, and you can't ignore that the races exist within the human spectrum. So there is distinctions between. So even though races do go across a spectrum, it doesn't negate the fact that the different races exist. The next one that I hear a lot is there's more variety like within each race than between the races. So they always say that there's more variety within the race. So if you look at black people, there's lots of variety between the different black than between white people and black people. Well, to understand that, that's one of those arguments that really gets my mind thinking. Well, back to this color spectrum. If you look at the spectrum just between blue and green, what you'll notice is in between blue and green, there's really not much distinction. It's like, well, is it blue or is it green? There's sort of a overlap where it could go either way. Now, that does not mean just because there's that minor variation between the two, well, that doesn't mean that there's no large variation once you get to a darker blue compared to a lighter green. So there is a complete distinction between what is blue and what is green. Though in between them, you might see some crossover. So that's something really important to understand, that even though there's similarities between the two groups, it doesn't mean that the two groups aren't distinguishable. So the point is, if you look at the differences within a group, and we look at yellow, for example, you'll notice that there's a real variety of yellow. It goes almost to yellowish green, all the way over to almost orange. And yet, we still define the concept of yellow. So the point is, there's a lot of variety within the concept of yellow, but yellow still exists as a unique concept. Well, the same happens with race, that might be a lot of variety within that racial group, but that doesn't negate the fact that group does exist as a racial group. Okay, so if you remember this color spectrum, it makes it very easy to refute these arguments, because you can say, well, if you deny race, then you can say, well, hey, if you deny race, then you're denying color. And then you explain the spectrum to them. And it really works in understanding the way humans work, because it is a spectrum. But that doesn't mean that it's any less real that there are the differences between the different races, or that the races exist at all. So that is the third most common argument that I've heard. Now, another argument that I'll hear a lot is the word race isn't scientific, that scientists don't use the word race. Well, that's true. That is actually true. They use the word populations. And populations means almost the same thing, almost exactly the same thing as races. The only difference between populations and races is that we generally, with races, we have the four main ones, which are white, black, Asian, and American Indian, or native population of North America. So those are the four major ones. But with populations, they might have more variety within those racial groups, that they'll actually include Hispanic, Aboriginals. They'll have like South Asian versus Northeast Asian. They'll have different variations within the, not instead of having 4, they might have 10 or more different population groups that they refer to. And I've heard as many as 600 different population groups. So there's a lot more variety of terms for the different populations. And that's really the only distinction. And the quote that I always like is, "A rose by any other name would smell just as sweet." So globally, we use the word race, and it means exactly the same as what the scientists use, which is the word populations. So again, not really an argument. It's really that they're saying we don't like to use the word race, but there just happens to be this other term that is used as the way you would use race. So it's a non-argument. It's just basically saying we're choosing to use a different word. So it's a non-argument. So that's another popular one. The next one is race is only skin deep. And this is a popular one. And I almost implied that I thought that race is only skin deep when I was talking about the color spectrum. But I do not see race based on just the color of somebody's skin. It doesn't work that way. There's more to it than that. There's actually difference in the skeletal structures of the different racial groups. There's different brain differences between the different groups. Even the muscle is different. And even parasites that live on us have adapted to the differences between the different races. For example, white people are more likely to get lice because the lice have adapted to the European hair. So these are the kind of differences that actually are significant. They're not just skin, but they're more to it than that. They affect from every aspect of the human body. So there are differences. In one of my previous videos, I kind of related to the story of sprinters being dominated by West African males, that they're the fastest runners in the world. If that's where, if their ancestry is from West Africa, because their muscles are different as well. And because the bone structure of Africans compared to Europeans is different, that Africans, their leg bones are much straighter. They can actually run and walk better than Europeans. They actually can run faster as a result. And these differences might be small, but are enough at the high-end competitive level that they make a difference. So you can't ignore these things. And there's more to it than this. There's diseases that come into play, that certain groups, certain races are more prone to get certain disease. And if you ignore those facts, you can actually cause problems. For example, issues with lactose. Whereas Europeans have developed lactose tolerance, and they can drink milk, for example, compared to Africans, they really can't drink milk as well as Europeans can. So the different races have different advantages and disadvantages. It doesn't mean that one's better than the other. It just means that they're different. But it's important to understand these differences. Okay, so that leads into my next point that is always brought up by race deniers, which is that there's no purpose. There's no useful purpose to pointing out that there's different races. And that's usually what they'll come down to, and they'll say, well, this is all great. Maybe there are races, but there's no use for us to point those out. It just makes people feel excluded, or makes people feel different. We don't want that. We want to be inclusive. Well, as I was saying before, there's actually real reasons to understand the races, because if you know that a certain race has maybe a health issue that they have to watch out for, or some advantage that they might have, then you're going to try to promote that advantage. For example, I know that West Africans are very good at sprinting. Well, I'm going to try to use that knowledge when I create my sprinting team. I'm going to try to recruit those kind of people. certain sports kind of show the different advantages to each race. And it's not racist to say that, it's just factual that the different races have advantages at different sports. So knowing that can help you. And there's a lot of interesting studies that can come out of this, especially when it relates to disease, because we want to live longer, as everyone wants to live longer and live healthier. And if we ignore the differences and we just say, oh, we treat everybody the same, well, then we're doing ourselves an injustice, because we're not going to treat the problems correctly. We're going to ignore the differences that are important to understand in order to properly facilitate treatment of those people. So really important. It wasn't even an argument in the first place, but you can point out the usefulness of why we should look at the concept of race. Now, they'll go one step further, generally, and they'll come up with this last argument, which the concept of race was created by racists. Now, this argument I hear a lot as well, that, race is just based on racism. The concept of race, really idea not based on racists, but people trying to understand the differences within humans. Now, they would think that one group is inferior to another. That's true. But we always do that anyways. We do that as a people. Like, I would expect if a black person, saw a white person, they would be like, oh, that person's inferior because they're different. It's not that they actually, know that person is inferior, but we generally favor our own group. And it's just a natural tribalism of humans that we will naturally think that our group is better than any other group. And that's favoritism on our end. But it's not necessarily racism. But one of the things that we use to combat racism is once we get to know those people and understand them, then we're less likely to think that they're inferior. We'll be able to understand them better. And when you get to know somebody, you actually are going to become less racist with them. You just appreciate that person more as you get to know them. So the point is, the concept of race was developed by people who were European, and they were really trying to figure out where the different groups, the differences between them, and why these differences existed, and try to classify humans. Now, even before that, maybe a couple thousand years ago, we even had the concept of race. You could even see it within the Egyptian hieroglyphs inside the pyramids and the ancient architecture, that they would actually have paintings where they would show black early Egyptians and white early Egyptians and the different races. And they would actually not refer to them, but they would sort of point out the different races within the pictures. And the concept of race is a pretty old idea. And people have been noticing that other people have been different for a long, long time. And that is part of the reason why, if you look at the Romans, they always had this concept of anyone that's outside of Rome is a barbarian. And you think of that, and the concept of barbarian is usually somebody who is not a civilized individual, that they're kind of primitive. And for the most part, maybe that was true, but it's more than that. It's really saying that they're different, and their ideas are so different that we can't understand how they think, that they're just so different in the way that they think and the way that they are. They're physically different, they're mentally different, they're culturally different, that their culture and that appearance is barbaric to us. It's just foreign. So that's an old idea where people did recognize that people are different. And that's why you'll actually notice that people are very good at figuring out what race they are. They've done studies after studies on this, that if you give them four groups, the four major racial groups, you say, which do you identify with? Well, people will actually identify fairly closely, like 96 or 99% of the time. They'll accurately identify themselves into one of those four groups. And then, they'll even verify it via a genetic test. And they'll find that there's pretty much 100% connection. They'll actually be, well, not 100%, but pretty accurate that people can determine their own race. And that's because we do have this knowledge of the differences between the groups. So those are some of the major arguments, and I hope that I've done a good job of giving you a defense against these major arguments. The reason you have to defend against this is because it's unscientific. And when something is unscientific and counterproductive to the advancement of mankind, you have to fight it. And that's why I'm doing this video. I hope you appreciate this video. And this has been Socially Triggered. I hope you like, comment, and subscribe. And please give me your feedback. What do you think? Are races real? And if you don't think so, why? Why are they not real? Tell me, and I'll fight you in the comment section. Goodbye.